Council. Canadian International Council is a nonpartisan, not-for-profit. Our purpose is to connect Canadians with their foreign policy issues. And there's nothing more urgent or significant these days than the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So appreciate your presence here tonight. We're small, but we're mighty. I would invite you to stay afterwards and have a drink with us, maybe have dinner with us. We'll be having dinner with the speakers. Your opportunity, because we're a nice small group, is you actually get an opportunity to speak with the speakers. So yeah, you might not get with a larger. So without further ado, I don't think there's anything else I need to say. Is there? No, I don't think so. I think we're pretty good on the introductory piece. This is our first in-person event in 25 months. We last did this in February of 2020. So here we are, and I would like to invite Bryce to come up and introduce our speakers, please.
Hi there. So nothing too much more to add. I really just want to thank both of our speakers for making the time to come down today, both of which are quite specialized in speaking on the situation and today's topic on Canada's response to the invasion of Ukraine. Yuliia, who has a wide depth of knowledge on all things Ukraine, speaking from the Center of Ukrainian Studies at the University of Manitoba, as well as Nick Krawetz, who spent plenty of time not only discussing democratization in Ukraine, but also in having spoken before, previously on the election in Ukraine, and having another wide amount of information to share with us today. So that's all I have really to say for that. I want to turn the floor immediately over. You guys want to speak first, and then Nick shortly thereafter. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the introduction and for having me here today. Ukraine has a complex history of nation building and searching for one's sense of belonging on the geopolitical map of the world. Ukraine can be rather hard to understand as its identity and society are quite enigmatic. Enigmatic to the level that even Ukrainians themselves did not always understand it. Well, not until the Russians reminded them who they truly are. Today, we are at the 36th day of the 9-year war that is grounded in colonialism that has lasted centuries. The never again is happening. Sociologist Alice Boulding acknowledges the importance of looking at social phenomena through the prism of the 200-year present that all of us live in. She believes that the past informs the present just as much as the present informs the future. So it's quite often here for us in the West to continue to be surprised by the atrocities that we are seeing happening on the ground in Ukraine. We're thinking that Putin is one of a kind type of villain, but this is not the first time. This war is being justified by revanchist narratives and is grounded both in culture and history. We know that Putin believes himself to be an outstanding historian, and according to his imperial claims, Russia should have the exclusive rights over the inheritance of the Kievan Rus, which is a medieval state that existed on the territory of Ukraine, starting with the 8th century. As the center of formation of Slavic tribes just has to belong to Russia, even though the first state on the territory of Russia was not founded until 13th century. For him, Ukraine is important since he sees Kiev as a cradle of Slavic civilization, therefore Ukraine has to be part of Russia. And also we can see a special significance given to Crimea, not only because of its strategic importance, but because this is the place where the christening of the Rus took place. And by christening of the Rus, I mean the 10th century christening that was adopted by Saint Volodymyr, the Prince of Kiev and Rus. So therefore, Russia needs to have Crimea to preserve its status as the center of Eastern Christianity. And also we can see these narratives of justification of this war as holy war, the war that Russia is conducting in Ukraine right now. It's quite interesting. Timothy Snyder talks of the Russian myth associated with the baptism of the Kievan Rus as the time of purification before the world got fragmented by the outsiders. And we can see very similar narratives being used by Russia today when Putin calls out the fifth column and calls for the purification of society that needs to take place all over again. So according to some interpretation, the word Ukraine means borderland. And Serhiy Plokhy says that Ukraine is the gate of Europe. And historically, indeed, Ukraine has quite a unique place on the borderland of cultures and civilizations. This is the place where Islam meets Christianity, both Eastern Christianity and Western Christianity. This is also quite a unique place that's where existing on the periphery of several empires allowed for Ukraine to build quite a unique political culture that I would say is mostly grounded in the European tradition of self-governance, starting with an individual, up to community of Ramada, and up to a broader civil society and state. So we can see Putin being quite surprised how a lot of the resistance in Ukraine these days is organized on the local levels, the level of the city, the regional level. So in Ukraine, power is distributed mostly horizontally, unlike the vertical distribution of power that we can more traditionally observe in Russia. In Russia, there is a czar, and the person next in line after a czar is already a slave. And therefore, it is really hard for them to understand the Ukrainian identity and the power of the grassroots mobilization. Therefore, they miscalculated both in 2014 and in 2022, because they simply cannot grasp that removing a leader, removing a mayor, a president would not in any way destroy the result of the Ukrainian nation. So solving the Ukrainian question that the Russian president has recently spoken about is also not unique. And it is grounded in the realities of the late 18th century, beginning of 19th century. Back then, we can see imperial bans on Ukrainian scholarship, on Ukrainian language publications that lasted for almost 40 years. And this is around the time when actually for the first time, this idea of one big Russian nation emerges and that the imperial power are trying to impose on the Ukrainians. So in 20th century, we see national and cultural awakening of the Ukrainian people, which translates into several attempts to gain independence, with one of them that was successful. However, it did not last long because soon afterwards, the territory of Ukraine was occupied by the Soviets. And at that time, the policy of Ukrainization was adopted as Lenin and the Soviets at that time, they realized that somehow they needed to appeal to the Ukrainian minority if they wanted them to cooperate with them. However, unfortunately, this Ukrainization did not last long, as soon afterwards in 1920s, we can see forced collectivization and decolonization of the territory that was formerly known as the breadbasket of Europe, which translated into several hungers with the Holodomor of 1932-1933, which took an estimated of 4 to 8 million lives. It's quite interesting that it affected mostly areas of central and eastern Ukraine, which at that time were primarily Ukrainian speaking. And later these territories were resettled with ethnic Russians. So this happened on top of the mass imprisonment, killings of the intelligentsia, and also killings of the people who had any sort of connection to the outside world, especially the West. And we can see once again similar type of policies, or at least attempts to implement similar type of policies today, with the list of people who are to be prosecuted being created by Russia that they were hoping to bring to power. So in 1944, extremely similar fate was reserved for the Crimean Tatars that were deported by force, and then these territories were resettled by ethnic Russians. So once again, not much reckoning was ever given to national minorities, and both Crimean Tatars and Ukrainians shared extremely similar colonial experiences. And even though Ukraine was the second largest republic within the USSR, it was always seen as subaltern and denied cultural, ethnic, and political representation. So just a week before the proclamation of independence, a limited referendum was conducted on the territory of Ukraine, where 96% of Ukrainians supported the idea of independence. Then in 1991, Ukraine becomes independent, and at that time it inherits the third largest arsenal of nuclear weapons in the world, which was at that time larger than that of China, UK, and France combined. Because of the negative legacy of Chernobyl, significant international pressure, poor economic policies, and simply desire to disassociate with Russia, they decided to give up nuclear weapons. Therefore, in 1994, Ukraine signs non-proliferation treaty and later the Budapest Memorandum, which at that time assured but did not guarantee territorial inviolability of Ukraine. It was signed by Russia, UK, and US, and China and France later joined. And in this case, it's quite interesting that Belarus and Kazakhstan were in a similar boat as Ukraine, so puts a lot of things into context. And it's also quite interesting that in 1997, Ukraine signs treaty on friendship, cooperation, and partnership with Russia, under which the two countries acknowledge inviolability of their borders once again. And just a couple of weeks before that, Ukraine signed a treaty on status and conditions of the Black Sea Fleet, according to which the Russians were allowed to host their Black Sea Fleet in Crimea and Sevastopol, which basically lasted throughout most of the 2000s, basically up until 2017. So as you can see, Ukraine committed to more than a few concessions in return for that guarantee of territorial inviolability. But Ukrainians did want to choose a European future, which we can see from the two revolutions, the Orange Revolution of 2004 and the Maidan, or the Revolution of Dignity of 2014. And by European future, I would say the very word of Europe for Ukraine has a bit of a symbolic meaning. It means rule of law, democracy, prosperity, and simply elimination of corruption. As I would like to point out the Bucharest summit of April 2008, and this is when both Ukraine and Georgia were denied membership action plans to join NATO. However, the policy of open doors remained for the two countries, and at that time, Germany and France were the ones who vetoed a membership action plan for Ukraine. And this is right around the time when Putin, while meeting with President Bush, tells him that Ukraine is not even a real nation state and it should not exist. So in 2010, after pro-Russian President Yanukovych comes to power, he declares non-alignment for Ukraine, and he continues defunding the armed forces, a trend which basically continued throughout the entire 90s, up until that point. And at that time, the level of support for NATO membership for Ukraine was not high, and this was not a contentious issue for the Ukrainian civil society. However, his decision to withdraw from the deep and comprehensive free trade agreement talks with the EU did serve as a catalyst for a post-colonial movement for Maidan. And in particular, Serhiy Plokhy says that Maidan for Ukraine became farewell to Soviet legacy, an attempt to form a civic political nation that crosses national and linguistic boundaries, that is aware of its identity, ideologically, culturally, and economically, ready to move on and interested in a European future. And we know that further Russian aggression only reinforced this desire to have a European future. As I said before, in 2013, the support for NATO, the level of support for NATO was not high, but Ukrainians certainly have chosen that European future for themselves. And Russia's further invasion of Ukraine signified that for them, and I would say not so much for Russia as for Putin himself and his personalist regime, not only NATO membership, but also EU membership for Ukraine is a zero-sum game. Well, if not a negative sum game. You can argue about that one. So in 2000, Crimea gets invaded and a controlled referendum is conducted on its territories with 83% the population supporting the accession to Russia. And of course, this vote was as free and fair as any other election in Russia, as you can assume. And in 2014, Russia sends its special troops to foment unrest in eastern Ukraine. We should not forget that initially they tried to gain 6 different areas of Ukraine, but the support for that idea of Russian world simply wasn't there. And therefore they were only able to partially take control of the 2 areas, and the areas of some parts of the Donetsk and Luhansk regions became the battling ground for the Ukrainian armed forces on the one side, and then for the Russian armed forces and Russian supported proxies on the other side. And Ukraine has been at war since 2014. It very quickly lost its saliency, especially in the media, but Ukraine has been waging this war for all these years, and it has resulted in 13,000 casualties, massive human rights violations, and a lot of the citizens of the so-called DNR and LNR have been tortured into submission to that idea of the great Russian world. In after 90s, both Ukraine and Russia took rather different directions in terms of their development. So here I would like to quote some data provided by the Levada Center. As of 2021, 59% of Russians view the figure of Stalin positively, and 65% have nostalgia for the Soviet past. This statistics for Ukraine is just the opposite. 61% would prefer for country to function based on market economy, and there's certainly no regret over the collapse of the USSR. Furthermore, 59% of Ukrainians as of 2021 would like for the country to join the European Union. As from NATO membership, once again, we see very interesting statistics. In 2012, the level of support for NATO was 12%. Russia's invasion of 2014 reinforced the support for NATO, and it rose to 44%, which by 2021 skyrocketed towards 58%. And while right now it's hard to conduct a proper study, a lot are estimating that this number would be closer to 75%. But despite this enormous level of support for NATO membership, I should say that even before Russia's full-scale invasion of 2022, Ukraine's membership in NATO was a bit of a far-fetched ambition, because Ukraine never even received a membership action plan up until that point. So in 2022, Russians came with a maximalist goal of capturing the major cities of Ukraine, toppling Ukraine's government, reinstating pro-Russian leadership in just a couple of days. Russians clearly underestimated both the Ukrainian armed forces and the resolve of the Ukrainian people. It turned out that since 2014, Ukrainians have managed to build a more modern army with proper Western-style mission command, with empowered NCOs, and they actually have a lot to thank the Operation Unifier and the efforts of the Canadian Armed Forces personnel in training Ukrainian soldiers throughout all these years. Russians, on the other side, still have a Soviet-style top-down mission command model. They've certainly been lacking morale, struggled with coordination, struggled with logistics, and simply we've seen an outstanding disregard for the lives of their own soldiers and personnel. Ukraine might have been outnumbered and still is outnumbered, but it's certainly not outmatched. And since Russians have not been able to meet either their strategic or their tactical objectives within a couple of days as they have hoped for, they have resorted to the war of annihilation, to indiscriminate bombing of civilians, which, a lot of analysts are saying that it's likely that the war will remain in an attrition phase for quite some time. As for the latest news from the ground, we know that Ukraine has conducted several successful counterattacks, both on the northern front, on the eastern and southeastern fronts. And it looks like for now, Russians have given up the idea of encircling Kyiv, but once again, for now. And Ukrainian forces are defending Mariupol, but a lot are saying that since they are so significantly outnumbered on that front, it is likely that Mariupol might fall within a couple of days, and that situation will show us a lot about how the military operation will continue on that front. I wanted to share this slide with everyone of the Russian state-sponsored TV discussing the invasion of the Baltic states. So once again, we see an extremely maximalist goal that was being discussed by the TV host of invading and capturing the 3 Baltic republics in a couple of days, toppling their governments, reinstating pro-Russian leadership, and doing all of it under the pretext of saving the Russian-speaking population of those areas. While I'm not saying that these are the actual military plans that Russia is planning to wage in the future, it does say a lot about the militarization of the Russian society. Just the fact that we can see narratives like this being discussed on TV. We know that identity politics is constructed, and in Russia's case, they're being made to believe that the collapse of the USSR was one of the major features of the 20th century, and that the Russians lost the Cold War. Putin wants and uses retropolitics as well as chauvinistic nationalism, where victory for Russians is becoming the new religion. You can see a lot of the terms and lessons learned from the World War II, such as genocide or Nazis, being reused and perverted to mean whatever Russia wants them to mean. At the same time, we can see such slogans as "Спасибо деду за победу" coming back, which means thank you to my grandfather for the victory. So once again, those narratives from the World War II victory are coming back. And even some people that were brought from Crimea to already occupied Kherson were trying to write those sentiments and those slogans on the occupied territories, and people of Kherson did not let them do that. So for Russia, near abroad is their domain. Therefore, Ukraine's history, Ukraine's language, Ukraine's culture are illegitimate. They do not have the right to exist. Only the imperial history is the legitimate one. And the revolutions that Ukraine has gone through are not revolutions. They are Western orchestrated takeovers. And Ukraine does not have any agency or the right to decide for itself what its foreign policy or alliances should be. It's up to Russia to decide that. We often like to refer, or at least we hear it being referred to in the media, Russia's war in Ukraine as Putin's war. But let's not forget that 2/3 of the population of Russia support Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, the recent poll conducted by the Levada group says that 83% of Russians support this invasion. And the approval rate of Putin has risen within the last month after the invasion. You can see extremely concerning rates of justification of violence, of hatred and distrust of the West, normalization of war, and attempts to bring that old glory back. So there are numerous reports and pictures that we can see from the social media where a lot of Russians are using the Z signs to signify their support for the so-called operation. And also, once again, such slogans as "To Berlin" are reappearing. So clearly the Russian public is trying to relive the good old days of occupying a major part of Europe. So despite the ongoing Despite the ongoing peace talks, we know that Russia is continuing to resort to indiscriminate bombings of civilian objects, maternity wards, humanitarian corridors. They certainly are using prohibited weapons. They are capturing and killing journalists and detaining mayors, once again trying to destroy the resolve of the Ukrainian people. We can see them shooting at protesters in Kherson and other areas that they have already occupied, and even deporting people by force, removing their documents and passports and settling them into far eastern regions of Russia. Once again, history is repeating itself in a negative term. And another one, I shall say also, We can see them destroying farm equipment on purpose in Ukraine, once again trying to also undermine Ukraine's agricultural production for the next year. It is common to hear such words as Ukraine crisis or Ukraine conflict. I'd like to communicate the message that a lot of the Ukrainians would like us to hear. This is not a conflict or Ukraine conflict or Ukraine crisis. This is Russia's war of Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Since 2014, many have been questioning what was happening in Ukraine, sometimes referring to it as separatism, when all along it was just Russia's war in Ukraine, Russia's invasion of Ukraine. It has been emphasized that Ukraine's corruption elimination record might not be perfect. Therefore, perhaps Ukraine's voice is illegitimate. Some claims of nationalism have been made, and in fact, Ukraine has managed to build civic nationalism that crosses both ethnic and linguistic boundaries. And probably my least favorite one is the talks of legitimate security concerns of Russia over NATO's expansion eastward. I think that this argument completely undermines the agency of not only Ukraine, but also other Eastern and Central European states. I'd like to quote Stephen Kotkin on this. He says that there are internal processes in Putin's Russia that started in Yeltsin's Russia, which predate both of them, where the recourse to autocracy, the recourse to oppression, the recourse to militarism, the suspicion of the foreigners. This is not a reaction to something that the West does or does not do. These are internal processes that have a dynamic of their own, and NATO expansion became an excuse post factum. In fact, I believe that if NATO's security framework was not expanded eastward, it's likely that those Central and Eastern European states would be in a very similar state and condition as Ukraine is right now. We know that Russia signed the Helsinki Final Act, Russia signed the Charter of Paris, and the Russia-NATO Founding Act, and all three signified the right of the nations to choose their foreign policy and their alliances as well. We also know that no guarantees, no promises were ever made to the Russians, unlike the claims that we sometimes hear, let's put it this way. Putin might be a decent storyteller, but certainly he's not a good historian. And it is important for us not to buy into his narratives, even partially. He might not have intended it, but he has certainly made Ukraine stronger. And I believe that Ukraine will come out of this as a stronger, better, and a more democratic nation than ever. And it is important that the world has got an opportunity to see what Ukraine really is. I guess I'll stop on this and I'll let Nick proceed. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much for coming here today, and thank you to CIC for the invitation to participate in this event. And I thought I would begin my remarks or my portion of the presentation on a personal note of what has been motivating me, I guess, over the last number of years from my advocacy on certain files, but also just the human sort of factor. I'm a third generation Ukrainian Canadian. My wife is from Ukraine originally. She came to this country about 10 years ago and became a citizen about 3 years ago. All of her family is still in Ukraine. Her parents, my sister-in-law, brother-in-law, my 9-year-old nephew. And they lived, I would say, next to the runway at Borispol Airport. It's the main airport serving Kiev and the country itself. On the first night of the full-scale invasion, they were forced to flee their home, and they are internally displaced right now in Western Ukraine. Over the last probably 20 years or so, I've been able to go to Ukraine. I've had various opportunities, probably about a dozen or so times to go to the country, including 6 times as an election observer on behalf of Canada with the OSCE, and also just on behalf of the Canadian government through Canada and CanIOM, the sort of the bilateral observation missions for various elections at all levels of government. This is a photo from Kharkiv, actually, in May 2014, the first election after the revolution, where Petro Poroshenko was elected. The photo on the left was just taken 2 days ago. In Ivaniuk. Cities are being destroyed as we speak, and it strikes me personally, just knowing that people I worked with and streets that I walked and so forth are being wiped off the map right now. So that's really where I'm coming from and how I view what's happening. And so also motivating me to help as best as I can and advocate and write to our elected officials to increase support for Ukraine. So with that, I'll just start by what has Canada done over the last number of years since Ukraine has become independent? Canada has supported Ukraine through a wide-ranging package of assistance, you name it, so diplomatic, finance, trade, investment, defense. They've done the whole gambit of support for Ukraine, which is great. And since January of 2014, they provided almost $900 million in direct support to Ukraine. It's a very substantial amount. However, given the current reality in Ukraine, I'm arguing that Canada must enhance and increase its support for Ukraine. As Yuliia mentioned, we are entering right now a phase that the war is going into a war of attrition. This is not going to end anytime soon. This is not going to end next week. This is going to go on for months, if not years. And Ukraine right now is really on the front lines of the international sort of community of defending democracy. They are defending Europe. They are defending liberal democracy, which in turn is Canadian security as well. And over the last number of years, we've seen democracy recede around the world. That is a very troubling factor. And if Ukraine is allowed to fall, that will have immense ramifications for international security, whether it's the South China Sea, whether it's Taiwan, other places. It is very, I would say, intense, to put it that way, that Ukraine cannot be allowed to fall because we will be paying for it sooner or later, and we will be forced as Canada to become more directly involved with our NATO allies and other allies around the world if Putin is not stopped in Ukraine, because he will not stop, and he must be stopped. Yuliia mentioned Operation Unifier. This is something I would say that this is arguably Canada's most successful programs in way of supporting Ukraine over the last number of years. This military training mission was extended a few months ago up until for another 3 years, and they've trained over 33,000 Ukrainian servicemen, National Guard personnel as well, and they've saved, based on this training, numerous lives. It's because their training is playing out right now on the battlefield. They've trained from medical response, identifying unexplosive ordnance, IEDs, a very full range of support. And also it's a two-way training mission for Canada, because Ukrainians are now highly specialized in trench warfare, hybrid warfare, something Canada has not faced in generations since the Second World War. So definitely it's a huge support, and it must be continued. It was continued, however, the personnel have been pulled back to Poland when the full-scale invasion started. And actually, this is a photo of some personnel that were serving at CIC Shiloh, just outside of Brandon, who served in Operation Unifier, and the Ukrainian community here a few years ago wanted to express our support for them and to show our appreciation of how they've helped save their Ukrainian brothers and sisters on the front lines, but also civilians too that are safe from their training. So in terms of military support from Canada to Ukraine, the Canadian government has provided both lethal and non-lethal equipment. However, a lot of this equipment and support has come, I would say, after the fact from other allies, US, UK, the Baltic countries, Poland. They are really at the forefront of providing support to Ukraine. Canada is up there, but again, it's more so, it comes a day or two after these other countries have announced things of support. In terms of non-lethal aid, again, we provided a full range of all kinds of support to them: communications, field hospitals, medical kits, night vision goggles, personal protective equipment, individual meal packs for soldiers. So, this stuff is having a tangible effect on the front lines and for the Ukrainian armed forces. In terms of the lethal military equipment, ammunition, machine guns, rifles, carbines. However, some of this stuff is almost 50 years old, 60s, the 1960s, 1970s. So you can imagine, a Ukrainian soldier firing something that may or may not work, and it may not be reliable as such. In the last probably month or so, they've also stepped up other military aid. And in terms of actual tangible kind of stuff that can actually be used to fire at Russian forces, rocket launchers, hand grenades, and so forth. But really, there's been a lot of talk over the last month or so about the no-fly zone, stepping up assistance for fighter jets, more sophisticated air defense systems. This is something that Ukraine's in badly need. However, Canada is not really in a position to provide this kind of stuff because of our own aging equipment and decades of neglect and underinvestment in our armed forces. And this war has really highlighted that. I think it may serve as an impetus here in Canada to increase our defense spending, which compared to other NATO allies is amongst one of the lowest. I think we're fifth last in terms of a percentage of our GDP. I think we're at 1.4%. The target is at 2%. So that may have ramifications for taxpayers here when our tax dollars are going. Canadian sanctions and other international sanctions against Russia. Canada has sanctioned about 700 or so individuals from Russia, 200 from Ukraine or so. And these are mainly kind of collaborators or sympathizers, and also some Belarusians as well, because Belarus is also complicit in this invasion, using their territory to allow attacks. And also in the early days of the full-scale invasion, there were actually artillery being fired from Belarus into Ukraine. So they're certainly a party to this conflict as well. Canada has also revoked most favored nation status for Russia and Belarus, which basically translates into a 35% tariff on Russian imports into Canada. After many years of the community advocating for the government and CRTC to ban Russia today, they finally did so, which is something which should have happened a very long time ago in terms of spreading disinformation, propaganda. They've also been feeding into COVID-19 conspiracies and so forth on Canadian airwaves. So this is something that should have been done long ago, way before the full-scale invasion. In terms of the effectiveness of Western sanctions, it's very debatable whether they're working or not. There's been a lot of talk about cutting Russia off from the SWIFT system, the financial system for international payments. However, there's significant loopholes still in that. Only 7 Russian banks in total have been cut off out of all of them, and only 1 out of the largest 5 banks is cut off. The largest bank is still connected to SWIFT right now. So if they wish to do more, they can be doing more, and they should be doing more. And increasing support means increasing support for Ukraine and pressure on the Russian regime, I would say, to cease what they're doing. The humanitarian needs are immense right now. There's an estimated 10.5 million people that are displaced, including my family. 6.5 internally, 4 million now that are abroad in Poland, Slovakia, Hungary, Moldova. And there's also an estimated additional 12 million that are currently stranded in the country due to cutting off from infrastructure, roads and bridges being destroyed and so forth. People lacking information on where to go for safety. So this is 22.5 million people. The scale is immense. This is half of the country's population. On March 17th, the Immigration, Refugees and Citizenship Canada launched this long sort of awaited pathway. They first announced it on March 3rd, and they said check back in 2 weeks for more details on how to apply to this program. It is operational now. And in the first 2 weeks, almost 80,000 Ukrainians have applied for it. These people, though, however, are not refugees. That's a very misconception of what these people will be, what kind of supports they will have when they start coming here. But as a legal status, they are not refugees. And up until yesterday, the federal government was providing 0 support to these individuals. The announcement yesterday from the department was saying that they will broaden the eligibility to federally funded support and settlement services. However, it's only a temporary measure and it's only for 1 year. And it does not include the full range of supports, only a limited package of supports. But in terms of the program overall, it does provide greater flexibility for Ukrainians to come to Canada. They're able to come here for up to 3 years to work and study, but essentially they're going to be a visitor and with an option of a work permit. So right now there is talk about advocating for more support to these individuals because a lot of them fled with the clothes on their backs or their essentials. And they're going to be coming here with very limited finances. They're going to be stepping off the plane into housing, language training, and so forth, jobs. So that's certainly something that the community is working on with the provincial government and the federal government. But overall, the program itself can be improved. There are significant bureaucratic red tape and hurdles that these people have to go through to apply for this program. The portal itself is very confusing. And for someone who has not done it before, doesn't speak English, it's very difficult for them to navigate this system. And the delays and the backlogs that are being created are something that could be totally prevented. And just to give you an indication of how much time these people have to wait, if they're able to apply for this program, they're being told you'll be initially contacted within 5 days for an initial response. If it's positive, then you will move to the next step, which is a biometric collection for your fingerprints and photos. And before this program was even open, there was a 2-week wait in Poland to get one of these appointments. 2 weeks later, the wait now is 2 months in Poland for one of these appointments. After that, then if they pass that step, they'll be asked to then mail their passport away when they've already fled a neighboring country with their only form of identification to the visa center to get the visa stamped in the passport. That can take up to another 2 weeks. So far, after this program is just starting, it's already about a month and a half wait. So again, if you fled with nothing, you've had limited funds with you, you're looking for housing in Poland or wherever you are, your funds are running out almost right now. So the longer they wait, the more vulnerable they become, and particularly for women and children too, because right now, if there are cases, and there's a trend as well. People can be preyed upon, women can be trafficked, children can be potentially kidnapped or abducted. It's a very horrendous situation, and they can be potentially re-traumatized as well while they're waiting, and left sort of left in limbo with their anxiety and frustrations and so forth, and trying to deal with this portal system. So I could probably talk about this for an hour or so because I've been advocating for visa reform for about 8 years. But and this program can be improved, and these people could be coming here much more quickly if the government wants to do so. What is Manitoba government doing in response to the war in Ukraine? So far to date, they've allocated $800,000 to humanitarian aid and relief efforts through various charitable organizations here in Canada and Manitoba. They prioritize applications and waived certain fees, about $500 application fee in the Manitoba Provincial Army program. They've also created a hub with various resources, and the government itself has struck 2 committees internally with deputy ministers from various departments, and also the Ukraine Response Task Force, which is supported by 5 full-time provincial civil servants. And these groups are meeting with the Ukrainian Canadian Congress regularly on a weekly basis to discuss the range of supports that are needed in terms of housing, social assistance, language, and that sort of thing. And so forth. In terms of community mobilization, every revolution happens every 10 years or so in Ukraine. The community comes out and mobilizes, but this one I think is quite different because I have not seen sort of the degree of mobilization in terms of this one as opposed to other circumstances. This is really a whole of community approach and mobilization to what is happening. And this is led by the UCC here in Manitoba and also various committees of volunteers, just trying to help and assist these people that are coming, people that are fleeing to neighboring countries, and supporting the armed forces through donations and so forth. So in terms of UCC and other volunteers, they created an aid center at 935 Main Street. They're collecting items for individuals. They've already shipped 2 shipments to Ukraine in terms of humanitarian aid and also equipment from the armed forces. We are communicating with potential host families here, registering incoming Ukrainians, and there's been all kinds of town halls, webinars such as this. But there are all kinds of meetings happening with partners, stakeholders. So if anybody is interested in helping in this regard or volunteering, please let me know. And certainly any sort of assistance that you may have. And also, which is actually quite interesting to see, is all kinds of our organic kind of community initiatives. It is individuals stepping up through private donations or pinching pierogies, pancake breakfasts, church groups, collecting clothes. It really is quite something. And every day there's sort of new information coming saying we've raised 5,000, we've raised 10,000 just through ribbons or whatever it is. That is having a tangible effect because really these people are posting images or they're shipping things, and in a matter of 3-4 days, you see the items from Manitoba on the front lines. So it is really quite something. Also, in terms of how you may help, or if you're interested in helping, UCC on their website here in Manitoba has various sections of what you can do in terms of the Help Ukraine section. There's a whole list of charitable organizations that we want to review or potentially donate to in terms of housing supports, provincial resources, and so forth. Various fundraisers, call for volunteers. And if you have an idea, there's another way of helping that way. We are open to that kind of thing, and we want to partner to ensure that the people coming here will be supported from day one once they get off that plane. But also, there needs to be that help for Ukraine itself, helping to defend itself, and certainly with the armed forces as well, and the other volunteer brigades. There was just a story in the paper today where a dance group somehow got 100+ body armor to ship over. So again, this stuff is happening daily, and there's all kinds of ways to help. Maybe I'll stop there and have a discussion, and I'm happy to answer any sort of questions in terms of Canada's support. I'm sure you can also answer in terms of historical context. Thank you very much.
So I have a question for either of you here. Where do you feel Canada should put its more palpable support towards? Should it be in helping with the visa situation of those who need to emigrate out? Should it be in terms of providing greater financial support? The note that was made, certainly, that Canada tends to follow behind some of the allies means that we could do more to take the initiative. So where would you like to see the initiative of Canada's federal government, at the very least, to throw its weight behind, that we, being citizens, can further support as well?
Great question.
I think on the diplomatic level, Canada can certainly play more active role because those sanctions are a bit more uniform across the board. And probably a lot more work could be done to help persuade some of the European partners to do what's right to support Ukraine. When it comes to logistics, I was mentioning that twice already, Ukraine is in desperate need, even of basic protective gear, such as helmets and night vision goggles. So even such, I guess, the most standard military items could be of great assistance to Ukraine, and they're needing them desperately right now. So there are certainly ways to help and assist.
Yeah, I would also add that there was actually some remarks from our foreign minister a few days ago saying Canada has this convening power. But really, I thought that was actually quite shocking because Canada has a proud history of providing assistance to war efforts and providing personnel. But if our own foreign minister is saying that's all we have to offer is convening power, I don't know how to put that into perspective. And I really think in terms of the humanitarian context, again, we have all kinds of expertise in this country in terms of providing support, logistics, providing aid to people that have fled these horrific circumstances. And right now, I don't see Canada on the ground in neighboring countries providing that kind of support. Really, Poland has stepped up. They've already absorbed 2.5 million people. At some point, those neighboring countries will not be able to keep absorbing people. They'll need some sort of relief from allies and partners. And here in Canada, we have the largest diaspora outside of Europe. we are uniquely positioned to welcome these people and support them right off of the plane. So I really think Canada can enhance and bolster efforts on the humanitarian level to get those people to safety in a much more quicker way, and to provide supports for them and to broaden the eligibility. Because really, again, as I mentioned, they are not being treated as refugees, which is in contrast to some of the European countries. Again, we've welcomed people from Syria, Afghanistan, other conflict zones that have gotten all kinds of supports from day one. And I really think Canada can be doing that.
Why do you think they are avoiding the refugee? I mean, is it purely money?
Well, interesting question. In terms of the applications, I guess I would say 80,000 alone in the first 2 weeks. That's a huge demand. And I don't want to say that they don't want these people here, but really, I think they're just kind of buying their time to see how many stay in Europe, where they go, and whether or not, how many will ultimately choose Canada to come here. So I think really they are just kind of in a holding pattern to see how this plays out. And if they do allow them to come here in a much streamlined fashion, some may claim refugee status or asylum status, and I don't know if they're ready to do that or accept those people in that way. So I'm not sure that if that is their logic or thinking or not. But certainly in terms of the advocacy, in terms of visa reform over the last number of years, this is something that Canada stands in stark contrast versus other countries. 142 countries allow Ukrainians to come to their country visa-free or obtain a visa on arrival. Canada is not one of them. And it really stands in contrast to the European Union, which has allowed Ukrainians to come to their country since 2017 without a visa. So that's why you see these Ukrainians traveling there so easily. You can go there for 90 days if they have a biometric passport. Normally, they can do that and stay there. So they can go to Prague, they can go to Warsaw, go to wherever else, but they can't come to Manitoba. And that's what I've been advocating for saying Ukrainians should be treated like Europeans. If they're defending Europe and defending our security, treat them as such and allow them to come. But historically, in the 1990s and early 2000s, the economic circumstances in Ukraine were not very good. They were quite dire. There were people coming here and overstaying their visa. However, people from all countries do that. But really, since the context has really changed since 2014 onwards, to obtain visa-free status with the European Union, Ukraine had to complete 400 plus reforms to obtain that status. So the context has changed, and the historical pull factors to Canada are no longer as great, because if they can go to Italy, Paris, why come to Winnipeg? Really, it's just not that sort of that the carrot to come here is not as orange, as it used to be. So maybe that is still there, and also too, quite interesting. Canada, since Ukraine has achieved independence, Canada has never reviewed its visa policy towards Ukraine in 30 years. They've never done it. They were going to start this process in May 2020. However, during the pandemic, they were going to go to Ukraine to do an assessment mission. However, it got postponed and canceled due to the pandemic. So, if they were reviewing their policies before, in terms of the context changing after 2014, perhaps these people wouldn't be going through this process right now. They could have already been here. And really, I just find that very disturbing, because there's no need for re-traumatizing these people and forcing them to wait and fill out bureaucratic paperwork. They've just fled missiles and bombs, and asking them to flee and travel through a war zone, and then asking a woman with small kids to figure out a portal system and stand in a line at a visa center for 48 hours, 72 hours, and trying to figure it out by themselves with no help. I think it's inhumane.
I have a question for both of you. I'd like two different perspectives. One plywood. I've encountered, and I want to be speaking for anybody else, I have encountered a situation where by getting aid directly to wherever it's needed, it's an avenue that I was kind of surprised to see. By the same token, I'm glad it's there. I'm glad that I was able to participate to a minor extent with it. I hear nobody talking about this approach. And it's a very simple sort of thing. And like I said, I don't want to talk about I can point you in the right direction. I've heard neither of you people speak. It's just sort of a, I don't know how to describe it. It's very direct, very simple, and very effective from what I've discovered so far. That avenue of approach is through one of the local churches. I don't hear either of you talking about it. I went to Saradov. I went to one or two other Ukrainian organizations. Like help in any way. It's a good thing I went down to this particular church as it was. I was just amazed that this could be done, especially in time. Any comments?
Maybe just if you can maybe reword your question in terms of volunteering at churches and providing support or
getting the aid.
sending the
to, yeah. And in a very quick way. That's sort of the way it happens, but in this situation, first to bring courtesy and to contacts. Very direct, very effective from my standpoint. And the way it was explained to me by the police I was given, it's awesome. And especially at the time, I hear nothing from like you talking about this.
Well, I suppose I can address this one. There's a lot for us to cover here, starting from the basic concepts and areas of organizations that are providing assistance. Certainly, I've heard many recommendations, especially from Ukrainians, asking to help out the organizations that are working on the ground as much as possible, or the Ukrainian Canadian organizations that have good background and understanding of the Ukraine, the dynamics, how things work, how to get things through the borders, how to work throughout the bureaucracy, and all these ways. There's certainly more than one way to help and assist. But if possible, supporting Ukrainian organizations on the ground that are actually there, run by Ukrainians, who are providing direct assistance to the cities who need it, such as Mariupol, Kherson, as much as they can. That is of primary importance. We know that unfortunately some of the larger NGOs have not been as effective in dealing with assisting the Ukrainian people as we would like them. So there's certainly a lot to be uncovered there.
Maybe get to that as well. On the help UCC website, under the help section, there is a list of about probably 20 or so ways to donate. There are no shortage of ways to donate if you want to be more direct or through other international organizations and so forth. And actually, we just, when this all began too, the National Bank of Ukraine opened up various ways to fund directly the armed forces or humanitarian assistance. And some of the church groups are taking that avenue as well. But again, there are dozens of ways to donate. And it can be as direct or indirect as possible. But to Yulia's point, there have been a lot of criticism around in Ukraine and also the neighboring countries where the international organizations like the UN, UN refugees, they're just not visible. People aren't seeing them there. That is also very concerning because that is their mandate to provide that kind of support, right? And right now with the Red Cross, there's also some, I guess, differences of opinion of how they're operating and providing aid and so forth. But here in Canada, the Canada Ukraine Foundation, for example, they have raised almost $20 million and have dispersed about 6 or 7 already. So aid that is being collected here is getting there very quickly. And there are ways to go very direct to get directly to the armed forces if you want. It's just a matter of entering the credit card information. So I'll maybe just leave it there. But
I'd like to make another comment.
sure.
It's being correct. If you want to deal with a party like the Red Cross or another huge organization, I find it's a waste of time, especially in a situation like this. If anybody wants to contribute, I'll tell you where I went, UBC, and you don't have to tell them how you got the information. Doesn't matter to me, but I will say that may or may not get a proper receipt, a monetary contribution of sorts. Certainly, the money is getting.
Thank you.
Yeah, and sir, your comment also speaks to the power of mobilization in Ukrainian society that we have seen back in 2014 and right now, when volunteers are playing an extremely important role in organizing, moderating the support that and assistance that is supplied directly to the armed forces and to the National Guard in some cases, to the territorial defenses. So yes, there's more than one avenue to assist.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. So EU has already written out all of their financial assistance, how that would be. So they have that. We currently still nobody have coming to the feds or the province around that. Dancing on that issue. Many people come, but there is really clarity as to what portion is supported, how is education, etc.
Yeah, it remains to be seen, and really the burden is being on the provincial government really to help these people, because up until yesterday, as I mentioned in the presentation, the federal government was committing zero support to these individuals. So they were saying, come to Canada, but you're basically on your own.
Is that changing yesterday?
They brought in some eligibility to the federal support programs for settlement services, but really it's only a temporary measure. It's only for 1 year up until March of 2023. So if they're coming here for up to 3 years under the process, they'll only be supported in a limited way for up to 1 year. So what happens after that? So it's it's concerning, obviously, and really without a family or friend connection here, very difficult for someone to come here on their own, settle, transition, and that's why UCC and others are meeting with the provincial government, advocating to the federal government to increase these supports now, because these people stuck in limbo in these countries, they're on their phones scrolling right now, what to do, where to go, and they're looking for all kinds of, I don't think incentives, but they want reassurances that they're going to be coming halfway around the world. They want to know that they're going to be supported. But right now, unfortunately, there is not a lot of information in that sense. And the burden is on the provincial government to step up and continue efforts, unfortunately.
And it's become almost an insurance. When I looked at the paperwork, the online application, at that time there was English, the application is not fully available.
Yes, it has changed, and it depends on your internet browser. So if you're browsing from Ukraine, it will be in Ukrainian. But really, the information is spread out amongst multiple web pages. Each page has about 10 or 20 different hyperlinks referencing different things and so forth. So for someone that's fled on their phone, trying to cross-reference this information and trying to read the instructions while trying to fill out the portal system, how are they going to do that? And it keeps crashing and so forth. They don't have a laptop or desktop with it on the trading platform in Warsaw, right? So very difficult for someone, and someone who's been through the process in normal times, very cumbersome, very complex. And if these people don't speak English or are not familiar with the process, very, very challenging for them to do that. And I know just from my own experience, we've been helping people. My wife has been on the phone for 5 nights straight, helping her friend try to fill out this portal system. I just can't imagine a senior or a woman with 3 kids or something, trying to watch them, but then trying to figure out how to apply for them to come here.
Can one do the application online
Yes,
and open an account for it?
yes.
With regards to sanctions, do you think that Western sanctions are the way that they are, so that the West still has cards to play before they use force? And then also avoiding that like awkward situation where if Putin does actually pull out, then they have to go through the difficult process of lifting the sanctions? Or do you think it's entirely based on a reluctance due to economic impacts and difficulty of actually having those harsher sanctions domestically? For both of you.
Maybe I'll be very quick to answer a few issues. I would say that the sanctions have not been effective. Really, the point of the sanction is to change the calculus of Putin, and it's not changed. Sanctions have been in place since 2014. It didn't stop them from invading further. And in terms of the loopholes that are still there, and I really believe that, given the dynamics in Europe with energy dependency, and they're obviously more directly impacted, I really believe that they're nearing the max of what they can do in terms of sanctions, which is concerning because, I guess Putin and the armed forces, his armed forces, can somewhat, get maybe initial sort of buffer to that, but I don't think sanctions alone are going to stop. Sanctions need to be in tandem with tangible support for the Ukrainian armed forces and its people to help defend themselves.
I think that part of Putin's culture is that we might not be able to unite and introduce those sanctions in the first place. So it is already quite positive news that we have some sanctions. Of course, they could have imposed more actual stricter sanctions that would affect the Russian economy. And unfortunately, it looks like right now a number of countries are waiting for further crisis, such as the use of chemical weapons or potential use of tactical nuclear weapons, or etc. So they're sort of saving some of the sanctions for later, which probably should have been introduced from the beginning. So that's a lot of conversations that could take place there, in particular, a number of European partners are discussing oil and gas embargoes and ways to work on that and the relationship with Russia. But certainly, I think the sanctions have been effective to some extent, and it is clear, but by the amount of even the partial amount of dissent that we are seeing coming out of Russia already shows that sanctions have been effective, maybe not quite as effective as we would want, not enough to change Putin's calculus as to what his further actions are going to be, but perhaps there is not much that we could have done to change his course of actions. It looks like he set his mind on the military option pretty early on, and unfortunately there wasn't much that could be done in terms of deterrence.
Thank you.
I see a few hands up. Sorry, I think you were first.
Question about the healthcare. I understand that they are doing any other problems?
Yeah, in Manitoba, they will be eligible for health care if they have an open work permit. So that's sort of an open work permit. So part of the application process is the visitor visa, but then there's an option to check off if you want to work, because you'll be allowed to work anywhere under that program. So if you do have an open work permit, you will be eligible for Manitoba Health.
How is it that children have to fight to get a job and saying yes or work?
Yeah, and that unfortunately, that's why there's discussions underway for additional supports in terms of the daycare. Because again, that dynamics of the displacement, if a woman does come here with 2 or 3 kids, who's going to watch the kids while she's potentially trying to survive and support herself, right?
I shall say the health coverage is not tied to working. As long as you get a work permit, you can receive health coverage right away, and then the person can choose whether, or not choose, but can try to find employment. But they should be eligible to get health coverage once they get the work permit. This is sort of how it works for international students as well. Upon arrival, you just receive that coverage.
Typically, there is a waiting period, but when someone does come, I think it's 3 or a few months before they allow them to be eligible. I think there are discussions underway to that. So when they do get off the plane, they'll be eligible from day one. But I'm not, I think
Well,
that's,
they'll get a work permit, if they check that box.
Yeah.
They get a work permit at the port of entry. The next day, they go get a SIN number and to the healthcare number, and that's good for the whole 3 years that they're here as temporary residents, right? So there's an idea of permanent residents, which we call as immigrants. So these are sort of permanent resident light. I mean, there's a finished when they have to, on that particular piece, have to leave for 3 years. But otherwise, so their kids don't have to pay international fees at elementary school, right? And so which is right off the top, which is a great savings. So, but I was going to make this point is it seems there's a lot of offloading from the feds to the provinces to take care of these. The feds are the ones that issue the work permit. But the province is the one who will eventually pay for the health care and the educational costs. Because they're one of those children that goes into the school system. So the leaders here know is a calculation against what the provincial grant to the school district. So it's it's a bit of a. So I think that it was offloading onto the provinces and onto some case onto the municipalities and school boards is a bit of a. Yes, it's unfair.
Likely it's a reflection of what politicians in Ottawa are doing. They're not doing what they should be. Do this back by whatever. So,
I know, you had a question, sir.
Yes. I find it incredible that this 3-day special operation in Ukraine can go for a full month. And Putin doesn't know whether or not he's being told the truth about what's going on. Is that a credible thing to assume that people aren't telling Putin what he's wanting to know or should want to know?
I certainly have seen some reports in the media based on the cross intelligence where they're stating that Putin might not be getting the complete information as to what's happening on the ground. In particular, we know at the initial stages he was not aware that the reservists and the conscripts were involved in the so-called operation. And it is likely that he might not also be aware of all the details of all the military aspects that are ongoing on the ground as well. That's one of the drawbacks of the authoritarian regimes. There are no corrective mechanisms, and things tend to just go down and down and down. There's basically the person, the next, like I was saying in my presentation, the next person up after a czar is already a slave, and they're afraid to tell him the news that might potentially upset him. So it looks like this is what might be happening in Russia.
So that's a credible assumption.
I certainly cannot say for sure, but it looks like based on the information that I have personally had a chance to read, it certainly looks like this is what is happening.
An interesting example of that is on February 21st, when Putin was recognizing DNR and LNR as independent states, he called a meeting with the Russian Security Council. And he called on each one saying, do you support this kind of thing? And the individual who's the head of the intelligence service, he was literally shaking to try to get the correct answer that Putin was wanting. So there may be some merit to that, whether he is in fact getting the most up-to-date or accurate information, or people are withholding them because they're scared to be thrown in jail or under house arrest, or we just don't know. But they are taking heavy losses that they didn't probably anticipate. There's indications of over 17,000 Russian troops have been killed so far. Those are massive numbers, and that's why you see this so-called pullback from Kiev and Chernihiv region, where they may be not pulling back, but maybe repositioning themselves to other areas on Eastern Front, Southeastern Front, and maybe they've given up on Kiev. We don't know yet. But in terms of Putin, what kind of information he's getting, I think it's anybody's guess from here. But really, the videos are incredible. You see his own apparatchik guys are shaking their pants when they're talking to him.
That was a stunning.
But at the end of the day, does it matter? Does he care beyond achieving whatever goal he's given them? You know, has he exercised the degree of mission command that he's had and said, go capture Ukraine, go defeat the Ukrainian armed forces, and don't come back and talk to me until you're done, kind of approach, you know? We don't know his mindset at this point in time, so we don't know if it would matter if he was getting the right information especially from a Ukrainian perspective. We don't know whether he would double down or back off. We have no clue at this point in time.
Yeah, the only person who knows what Putin wants to do is Putin himself.
That's right.
But the worry is, given the heavy losses that we are experiencing, you know, whether he will double down or not, you know. But unfortunately, Ukrainians are going to be the ones finding out, and they're going to be getting slaughtered if it is, even more so, right? So unfortunately, Ukrainians are these sacrificial lambs for this maniac's ambitions or, you know, view on the world. And really, that's why I think the international community really needs to enhance support on Ukraine on all fronts, because as I mentioned in my initial remarks, if Ukraine is allowed to fall, it's going to have massive ramifications, and the dominoes are just going to keep on falling. And you know, how that will affect us Canadians getting more involved, you know, that remains to be seen.
To me, it's just truly amazing how this great power did not manage to collect enough intelligence to realize that the support of the population for the Russian forces would not be there. You would think that they should have learned from 2014. Clearly, Putin just wants to believe what he wants to believe. You know that their armed forces personnel were given parade uniforms to take along. So they clearly were expecting that they'd be greeted with bread and salt. That they wouldn't even have to fight. We know that based on the food that was given to them, that those were some outdated items that they were clearly not expecting to even use. It's just quite interesting dynamic seeing the reality clashing with that some sort of I don't want to say crazy, but that would probably right.
I think
to
the
say.
intelligence
The
officer probably knew.
insane narrative that one person has in their mind, and clearly they see Ukraine differently than Ukraine is in reality. They just see what they want to see, and nothing else matters, and that's why it's so dangerous for Ukraine.
One maybe just final comment on that question. A few years ago, Russian activist, sort of opposition leader, Vladimir Krawetz was here in Winnipeg. He was speaking at the Human Rights Museum. He had a great speech, and he kind of summed up what's happening as repression at home and aggression abroad. And that sort of stuck with me, because you know, if you do speak out in Russia, you are thrown in jail. You know, you're beaten on the streets, and they signed a decree saying if you do speak against this war, you're going to go 15 or 20 years in jail. So I think that does have an effect on people's mindset of what kind of information they bring up to elected officials and so forth. It's terrible. There are Russians in Russia that obviously do not support this, but very difficult to speak out when you know you're threatened with 20 years in hard labor in Siberia. It's tough. Sorry, go ahead.
I've got another question. Maybe this should be formed. Pose this to them anyway. Maybe somebody on the floor can respond and maybe you might be able. I hear so much controversy about NATO's get involved in this conflict because of this Article 5. When I look at Article 5 on the internet, I don't know if I'm getting the full picture. These articles are so broad-based and very moderately worded, lots of open space. Am I not seeing all the meat and issues of these particular articles of NATO's chart, or is something else going on?
Well, sorry, go ahead.
The first thing you've got to understand that Article 5 only applies to member states. And Ukraine is not a member of NATO. Okay, so that's the first thing. Article 5 requires the allies to come to the aid of other allies when they're attacked. But that does not explicitly mean they have to enter combat to do that. They have to enter consultations and negotiations within the alliance to do something at Article 5, but it doesn't mean that they have to fly airplanes or drive tanks across borders. That is not what it means in the broad sense of things. Now, that's how we interpreted it in the Cold War, and it was probably more like that during the Cold War, that we would respond because we expected that it would be a shooting war from day one. But in the last 30 years, the modes of military aggression have morphed and changed with societies and technologies and everything else. And we've got little green men who aren't attributable, and we've got cyber operations, we've got all that kind of stuff that have really, really muddied the water. I think the big issue here for the rest of us and for the West, however you want to define the West, is return on investment and the risk factors involved in how far we go and get involved. That is the single biggest thing. What does it take to convince Europeans to go cold in the wintertime? Because that's what we're talking about here. We're talking about cutting off energy supplies to Europe because they're hostage to Russian energy supplies. Boo-hoo, we knew this. We knew that that was a problem, and we just blindly carried on because the only thing that mattered was economic prosperity. That's the only thing that mattered. So now we're in a pickle. We've got our friends in Ukraine in trouble, and we are not fit for purpose to help them for a whole bunch of reasons. And to a degree, we're held hostage. Why aren't those banks all being sanctioned and cut off from SWIFT? Because that's where the bloody oil and gas transactions are happening. And until so there's the problem right now is that Ukraine is unfortunately the canary in the coal mine. And we all know what happens to most of the canaries in the coal mine, unfortunately. Because now we're finally learning the errors of our ways. And so, oh shit, we shouldn't be so dependent on Russia or Saudi Arabia or Iran or some of these other petrostates with dubious, human rights records and motivations and everything else. So we are learning it on Ukraine's expense. So now how do we fix the problem that we've created for ourselves without sacrificing Ukraine or any other East European countries or countries something like that? That's the challenge we have. And part of the problem is we don't know. I mean, we can write our own red lines. We can say they use this, we're going to do that, we're going to do that, whatever. We don't know what Putin's red lines are. We don't know what it would take for Putin to do something more than what he's doing now, i.e., nuclear weapons, weapons of mass destruction, whatever. We don't know his lines. And the first priority of the Western governments is to their own countries, first and foremost. And perhaps they don't see the danger in what's going on in the Ukraine, or maybe they don't see it clearly enough. I don't know.
The Americans have warned exactly of this situation with the energy reliance on Russia, right back when they were planning that second pipeline.
Yeah, Nord Stream 2.
And they've been harping on it ever since, but they're the only ones.
Just a little more of a question to Neil's arguments. When I looked at the article, I picked up on Article 5 in particular. I want to see it because of Neil's reluctance to get involved. There's a lot. When I look at that article in particular, it's so brief and so wide open, have I missed something that's a little more detailed that gives a better explanation of why they should be reluctant to get in? Or this is just a single paragraph?
I don't think you missed anything. I think it's deliberately that way.
Certainly quite a bit complex. We probably continue this discussion afterwards, but we do have to wrap up as we're nearing the end. Any closing thoughts by the both of you?
Well, I guess I'll just comment to the point. I'll say that a lot of the alliance teams tend to have a certain amount of ambiguity and set up enough ambiguity, so therefore there's always a little bit of room for interpretation. As for why NATO is not more involved in Ukraine, Ukraine is not covered by Article 5, and unfortunately it's as simple as that. As for Russia, Europe, Russia, West relations, I think that for the longest time, the West has been trying to transform Russia, suffering from a little bit of Pygmalion syndrome, thinking that through rebuilding economic ties, we could reset relationship with Russia. I know a number of even American presidents, once the new ones would come to power, basically each of them would try to reset relations with Russia. But it turned out that unfortunately, some countries are not willing to transform and become more Western, no matter how hard they try. And therefore, in many ways, because of the lack of resolve after 2014 to what was happening in Ukraine, we have what we have now. So yeah, a lot to consider there. And I guess we'll stop with that.
Sure, yeah, no, great comment, Robert. And I would say in terms of NATO getting more involved, again, I think they're reaching their max of what they could do. Lots of talk about no-fly zone, implementing some sort of no-fly zone, whether it's across the country or just for humanitarian corridors. That will not happen, unfortunately, because that involves any kind of corridor, involves shooting down Russian missiles or planes. And NATO will not do that. So in lieu of that, that's why they really need to give Ukrainians the arms to defend themselves. Whether they do that some sort of lend-lease program or provide them the equipment, more sophisticated equipment to help defend themselves, that's really the only option. Individual members of NATO are trying to find creative ways to help them individually, but some of those initiatives are being shot down by NATO leaders, US, because they don't want to be dragged into a more broader conflict. However, I know if Ukraine is allowed to fall, then sooner or later they will be in a broader conflict. And potentially, the invasion of Ukraine is a practice run for other countries, whether it's the Baltic countries or Poland. And then I think they are buying their time to see how this plays out, unfortunately. But in the meantime, Ukraine is being obliterated and being wiped off the map. And then the human factor in all of this is, civilians being slaughtered right now at Mariupol. We've seen in Mariupol the horrendous videos. People are being thrown in pits. They're burying these people outside of their apartment doors because they can't even go to the cemetery. So, it's an absolutely horrific situation for these people. And unfortunately, I think Ukraine knows that only Ukrainians can defend themselves and defend their country in that kind of way. And these NATO countries will not be coming to their support in that way. They can do it through other means. But unfortunately, Ukraine will be fighting this alone in that sense. For now, anyways. So it's a very depressing end note.
Yeah, very diverse.
But I really don't, it's a realistic note, unfortunately. And that's why I think the community is so mobilized, because we recognize this. It's an existential threat for Ukraine, and it may become a more serious threat for our partners in Canada. And what that may lead to, I don't even want to imagine what that may lead to. So, thank you.